What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Wolf of Young Street podcast. My name is Victor. I'm your host. Today, I've got a guest. You guys don't have to hear me yap on for the next 15 minutes. My guest today is Lindsey Machona. She was the Liberal candidate for Edmonton Northwest riding in the just concluded federal election. She ran a brilliant campaign. I'm telling you guys, she gained the most votes that any Liberal has ever had in that riding. She got 20,000 people to vote for her. That's not easy. Ultimately, she lost to the Conservative candidate, Billy Morin. She's kind enough to join me on the podcast today. Welcome to the show, Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Victor. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So now that the election is over, I think let's start there. Now that the election is over, what happens now?
Things like this. I still continue the conversations with people who would still like to hear more about the campaign itself and what the future holds. But of course, there's so many conversations that are happening with regards to politics in our country. So I continue to engage with different people about the topical political issues in our country and in our province of Alberta and in our city as well. As you know, we have the municipal elections in Edmonton here in October. So there is that as well. And I've just continued to connect and have conversations with people in the riding, cultural groups, religious groups, businesses, and the different community leagues, just learning more, continue to learn about the riding and the challenges that people are facing and what their thoughts are and what they would want to see. And of course, just participating as an ordinary citizen into the politics of our country here.
Yeah. So I'm curious though. Obviously you've got an interesting origin story. You come from Africa the same way I have, and I want to hear that story. How did you go from your origins to now contesting in this particular election? That's a big jump,
Yes, I would say that was 45 years in the making, 44, 45. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, in Africa. And I attended my primary education in a neighborhood called Chitungwiza. So it's a dormitory town of Harare, which is the main capital city of Zimbabwe, rather. And I was a big believer in education. I was a dreamer from a young age, and I knew for me that education was the way out. I came from very humble beginnings. We didn't have much growing up. In fact, there was a time that I only had one dress that
wow.
yeah. And I faced, like many children, faced many challenges with accessing education. My parents, although they both worked, there were times during the school year that I couldn't go to school because they hadn't paid my school fees. So I missed some classes because my parents had not paid my school fees. But my father was a big believer in education. He would support me. He supported me so much and wanted me to do well in education, so much that even though he didn't have that much money, every beginning of year, he would get me some books. And so he invested in books for me. And so all I did was read and study. And what I remember doing as a young child is I would watch TV. There were times that we didn't have a television in the house, but there were also times that, one time we got a secondhand television from my aunt's friend. So we had a television in the house, those boxed ones.
Yeah.
And so I was very intentional when I watched television. I wanted to be more eloquent and more expressive in the English language. So I would listen to how they were speaking. My dream really was to get to university and get a good job and make a contribution that way and be a leader. So I always dreamt of being a leader, even when I was a young girl. And funny enough, whenever I dreamt about being a leader, it was always outside of Zimbabwe for some reason. I always saw myself in a different country. And back then I thought it was England, that I would be in England. It was what I saw on television, and that is what I emulated. And one thing that I did that I always share as part of my story is that at a time when we owned a television set, I was very intentional about the shows that I watched, and I would listen intently because what I wanted to do was to have a very good command of the English language,
Right.
and express myself better because I knew it was important to speak well if I was going to make a difference. And so I watched Keeping Up Appearances, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I would listen and then repeat those words. So I have a habit.
I don't know if the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is the example of great English you want to be copying, but okay then.
I know.
Okay.
But for somebody who's learning, anything goes. You're learning, and also I would say my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was a huge influence in my life as well. She did one thing for me that really I think set me up for success in terms of giving me the confidence. When I was 8 years old, when we had visited in the village, she put me in front of the whole village and then asked me to recite a story.
Wow.
Which I did, and I was very animated as a child and very confident, and so I say that was the first, that rock in the center of the village was my first stage, and my grandmother gave me the space and the platform, and so I knew I had a voice from back then, and so I've always wanted to be in front of people and speak and engage with people, and so we moved from Zimbabwe to South Africa with my family, and then we decided we wanted to be somewhere else where we could raise a family, and so we moved to Edmonton here, and that's how we moved to Canada. And when I got here, I think within 2 months of moving here in 2013 is when I reached out to the Liberal Party and I said, hey, I want to get engaged. And the volunteer coordinator then reached out to me and said, yeah, I would love to meet you, would love to have you on board. So I got oriented to the party, started volunteering, doing door knocking and volunteering on the phone bank. As a brand new immigrant to Canada, that's how much I loved politics. And so,
but how do you even have those conversations when you're a new person to the country? You hardly know anything yourself. So how are you having those conversations at the door?
We got training. We got training. Really, what we did as volunteers back then was to just get to the door and just say, I am door knocking for this particular candidate. They're running to be your member of parliament in this riding, and then give them a pamphlet. But if they wanted to discuss anything to do with policy, then we wouldn't do that as volunteers. We would, if the candidate was there, we would have them speak directly to the candidate so that the candidate could speak to policy issues, which is exactly what we did on this campaign as well that we just did. I would speak to the policy issues, but not everybody who was door knocking would speak to policy. They would just let them know that I was the candidate and then give them a leaflet.
Yeah. So what do people like at the door there? I'm assuming the idea is to get there and obviously people have their predispositions towards certain issues, right? You're coming to their door as say a liberal. They're not necessarily always going to be liberal friendly in their leaning. So I wonder what kind of conversations you were having at these doors.
So I had great conversations with people. There were just maybe 2 or 3 incidences where the conversations didn't go so well because people were angry and mad, but not at me, but more at the party and what I represented. And so I was always respectful. This is one thing that, my campaign team and I discussed, that, sometimes you will meet people who are angry, who are very passionate about the issues that they care about, and who don't think that, the party was leading well, who have different opinions about the Liberal Party. And so what we did really was to be understanding, to be kind, and being empathetic. And that worked really well for me, because I know conversations that didn't start so well, but because I was calm and collected and very understanding, we ended up having great conversations. And what I loved is at the end of those conversations, and I had a few like that, where they said, you know what, I'm not going to vote for you still, but I appreciate...
Come on, man. Come on. After all that.
yeah. But I appreciate that you're out here talking to people and that we could actually have a conversation, even though we were not agreeing. I loved that. And I'll tell you, Victor, this is what I wanted going into the election. I said that I'm going to bring my number one value, which is kindness. I'm going to bring this into the campaign. I'll bring this into every interaction that I have. every conversation, every email that I responded to, every phone call that I made, I led with my number one value, which is kindness. And I tell you, yes, there were challenges with things not working great, just like every project.
Yes.
You have things come up that you kind of have to deal with. But for me, I had a great campaign, and that's because I was really authentic to who I was.
Yeah.
Coming from Africa, politics is very toxic,
It is. Yeah.
and dangerous too, right?
As it is.
And
Yeah.
and so I wanted to bring a different brand of politics, and that's the politics where we can still engage in respectful debate and conversations, even though we don't agree, underlined by our shared identity as Canadians who love Canada equally.
Yeah.
And so that is what I brought into
I
the
mean,
campaign.
you say that, but I have to say, I mean, as someone who covers politics a little bit, and I say I try and be centrist. That was part of what I told you when I invited you for this interview. There are so many people, I feel, and rightfully so, that were, or maybe you can speak to how right it was that people were so angry with the Liberal Party and the record of the Liberal Party over the last 9 years. I'm curious about how you assess the record of the Liberal Party over the last 9 years. Obviously, what I want to tie that to eventually is a lot of, obviously during the campaign, there was a shift that led from the Liberal Party being down 25 points. You were actively involved in this election where the Liberal Party went from being 25 points down to winning the election handily. At some point, they could have won. They could have even won the majority. There was that possibility right there for them. So, but I want to start by sort of understanding how that felt on the ground as somebody knocking on doors, confronted by people who are frustrated with where the country is under the Liberals the last 9 years.
I would say there were some very valid frustrations that people expressed, which I acknowledged 100% because we all don't have the same experience with a circumstance or a situation. So I acknowledged and I probed more into what challenges they were facing and also what they thought the solutions would have been. Because this election was really short and we had a very short period to campaign. I really was not trying to convert people.
Oh, I see.
So with people, with individuals that would just say, "Oh no, I would never vote Liberal," we just did not have a deeper conversation about
I see.
that.
I see.
I mostly focused on individuals who were more leaning towards voting for the Liberal Party, but wanted to know who the candidate was. Like they wanted to know more about me, and they had questions for me. So those are the people that I mostly engaged with and gave my time to, because we just did not have enough time to have debate and try and change people's minds just because of how short the election was. But for the individuals that would vote Liberal anyway, they still had counter arguments to why they thought the Liberal Party was doing well. For example, an issue that came up a lot was there was global inflation. It wasn't just Canada, so we can't really put it on the Trudeau government that we had inflation in Canada. It was global. There are global wars that are happening that would obviously have a ripple effect on Canada and the economics of Canada. And so there were those things that came up from the Liberal side. But of course, from the Conservative voters, what I mostly heard was how Alberta is being ignored by Ottawa. That is what I heard mostly. So it mostly spoke to the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa. That is what people voiced and were not happy with.
Yeah, and we'll come to that relationship. I mean, some of the things, obviously you speak about the global inflation, and I can agree with you on that some of the problems that people place on the doorstep of the Liberals were global problems. But there are some in particular that people have pointed to in terms of we had what a lot of people deem to be uncontrolled immigration, immigration at a level that shouldn't have been. Stuff like, the economy of Canada hasn't grown to the extent that it could have over the last 9 years. which are all frustrations for people that reflect in people's pocketbooks, right? I know obviously this may or may not be your ballpark, but I'm just saying that there were frustrations like that, and I just wanted to get an understanding of how that played into the game.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll move this on to my other question, which is essentially, did you feel this on the sort of on the ground there as soon as Trudeau stepped down as leader of the Liberal Party and Makani came in as leader? How did that look like on the ground? That switch from being 25 points down, because I've never seen that. I can tell you, I've never seen that before. That switch from being 25 points down to at points being almost at about 5 points, or I think I was at the peak. It was around 5 points that you guys were leading, certainly majority territory. How did that feel on the ground?
That was really the reflection of the conversations that I heard and had with people. There was more of a renewed sense of hope in the party itself after the resignation of Prime Minister Trudeau. And when Mark Carney came and people got to know who he was, for those that didn't know him, and for those that knew his history with the Reserve Bank of Canada and also of the United Kingdom, they were impressed by his CV and what he had achieved in during his tenure in those two positions. And so there was a lot of hope, and he was an attractive candidate to individuals who had sort of lost hope in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his leadership. And so you could hear in those conversations, and people would express that, oh, this is a great candidate. This is a good thing for the Liberal Party that we've had this change in leadership. So people's sentiments and attitudes changed. There was actually a shift that people just expressed in normal conversations, that they were now going back to vote for the Liberal Party. So that's exactly what happened. There is no huge science behind it. I would say that is exactly what happened. There was a disillusionment with I guess what was the status quo then within the party, and then when that change happened, people shifted their attitudes as well, and so that is what reflected just before the election, during the election, and now after the election as well.
Yeah, I want to bring this back to you because we kind of departed away from your story. So you moved to Canada. Maybe you can tell me around what time you did that, and then we can. But I want to know how that journey became. Obviously, you were volunteering with the Liberal Party. How that journey became Lindsey Machona, the contestant for Member of Parliament.
Well, I got involved with my community earlier on, as well, not just in politics, but I wanted to be a part of the community. And part of the reason is when the fires broke out in Fort McMurray, I saw how people rallied together to support the communities that were affected by the fires. There were trucks that came from Edmonton with water and supplies on the highway all the way to Fort McMurray. People went out to volunteer, and people that had never volunteered before went out to volunteer with the food bank and to just come together and support this community that was in distress. And for me, I had never seen anything like that. I had seen a different kind of community in Africa where, yes, you know what's happening with your neighbor. You know when they had a fight last night. You know when they hadn't eaten.
Some might say that's a bad thing, that you know everything going on with your neighbors in Africa. But
and so you know when to support them and when to step in. But then when it came to actual resources, sometimes we didn't have the resources to be able to step in and support. When your neighbor needed money, for example, the community would not be able to come together as quickly and make funds available to solve a problem or to help a family or an individual go through a personal challenge. But what I saw here was the opposite of it. People don't really, some people do, like I'm generalizing here, people really don't get to see their neighbors that much. You may see them once a week. You don't know if they've eaten. You don't know whether they're in hospital or whatever. No, you don't. Some people may, but generally we don't, because we're usually working. But when something happens, like when the fires broke out in Fort McMurray, people came together to connect and brought resources. So it shows, that issue of, the global south not having much material wealth, but also rich in relationships. And
Yeah.
then, the north and the west really suffering some type of relational poverty, but also then being able to come together in terms of providing material resources when they're needed. To
Right.
me, that was not this community is better than the other, but that each community has its own strength that they tap into during
Right.
times
Oh,
of need. And
right.
so that interested me so much, and I felt blessed to have experienced both types of community. And so I wanted to learn more. So I enrolled at the University of Alberta into a master's program in community engagement because I wanted to learn how we can bring community together to
Mm.
solve our challenges, to build our economies, to build healthy communities, to support each other with mental health issues or whatever issues we were dealing with. And
Yeah.
so that involvement got me connected to many different people, and I would have conversations with people and then get to hear of opportunities. And then people would think about me whenever they had an event going on, and they would ask me to come and speak. And so that is how I started getting in front of people. I started being invited to different events to speak on issues that I cared about, issues to do with community, women and girls empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that put me, I guess, in the spotlight as a community leader. So whenever people needed somebody to speak on issues that were affecting a particular community, they saw me as somebody who was articulate and understanding, and then could come and speak to those issues. I started being called upon to speak at various events to do with community building, community projects, addressing certain political or community challenges that different groups were going through. For example, women and girls, and then the Black community here in Edmonton, the African diaspora as well, Black racism in Alberta, in Edmonton, in Canada in general. So I would get involved and engaged with many different groups. Even outside of the African diaspora here, I connected with different groups who saw me as somebody who could speak really well to the issues that were affecting communities. And that's how I, started being seen as a leader and being called upon to contribute that way. And so that's how I built the relationships and the network to becoming a candidate mostly. And so I connected with several key members of the party
Yeah.
and just offered myself to support,
Yeah.
to be involved, to be engaged. And I would say really what I started with was supporting other candidates
Right.
with their own campaigns. I worked on various campaigns over the years, doing door knocking, doing the phone bank. I volunteered as a communications lead for a woman candidate here in Edmonton who ran for city council. So I was on their campaign as well. And
Yeah.
then last year, a cousin of mine sent me a link to some training for women here in Canada who want to run for political office. And it's called Ask Her, which is run out of Calgary. And so I signed up for that. It was an 8-week program. And
Mm-hmm.
I was introduced and mentored into what it takes to run a campaign as a female candidate. It was at municipal level, but there was a lot that I learned from that. And so between that and people asking me to run and me creating the relationships and reaching out to seasoned politicians in Canada, most who are now retired, and just saying,
Right.
hey, can we meet up for coffee? I would like to have a conversation. What does it take to run a campaign? How
Yeah.
do I put a campaign team together? What do I need? What resources do I need? And from then I would say, is there anybody else at the end of the conversation? Is there anybody else that you think I should be talking to and meeting with? And they would connect me with the next person. And I would connect with that person, have coffee with them, have a conversation with them, and just say, I'm learning. I want to get involved, and so want to hear from those that have been in the trenches.
Yeah.
And so, if you're open to sharing, and not one person turned me down. I
Wow.
I met with everybody that I reached out to, and
Yeah.
they gave me their time, an hour plus of their time, just going through their story and their experiences, and then, giving me some advice. And so that
Wow.
ended with me submitting a nomination package to run for the Liberal Party here in Edmonton.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of what I was curious about, and there are some people that maybe would be interested in knowing this. To what extent do you think people vote for the MP versus voting for the party? And especially in this election that you've run here, to what extent do you think a lot of that? And I'm not asking you to talk yourself down. Obviously, you did the work to earn the votes, but I wanted you to speak to sort of the understanding of sort of the way people think about these things in your experience. Do people tend to vote for the MPs and knowing that these people engage in the community, knowing that these people participate in the community, or is it just a thing of, okay, the party they represent stands for values that I agree with?
I would say it's a whole lot of things. I want to be very, very open and honest about that. Um, there are some MPs that have done the work, where people have known them um, for a long period of time. They have been seen in the community to be doing the work, to be engaging with people. So they run one time and then maybe they lose, they go back again and they run, they continue to put in the work. And then, maybe the third or fourth time is when they actually get elected. And
Yeah.
so at that point, I think, people are actually voting for the candidates
Right.
because they have known them and they've built their relationship with them over time. And so they have proven themselves to be for the people and to have a heart for a particular community or riding. And so because of those relationships, then they then get elected. And I also think a part of it is, when we see a party put out a candidate, we believe the party has done the work of vetting the candidate
Mm.
and on our behalf, as voters.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so we believe the party has done its homework, and they believe that, this particular candidate is the best candidate that has been chosen from within the party or elected within the party to be the one then to be the representative in a federal election, for example, or
Yeah.
even a municipal or provincial election. And
Right.
this usually happens where, for example, where there was no time, like with this just ended federal election. It was really tough for new candidates to have built the relationships with the communities or with the ridings. Like most of us, when new candidates, yes, part of the community, known within the community, but on a very small scale.
Mm.
So I think people would believe that the party has done all the background checks on an individual. But also I would say I had a lot of people reach out and say, who are you? And ask
Right.
me who I was, and who would say, I went online and I read your story on your website, and I like that you work in international development with
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable communities, you work with children, and I like that you have been to the United Nations and have worked with the United Nations, and I like that you're a mother who has young children, because I have a 20-year-old son, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I have a 5-year-old son. And so many people
That's the full
resonate.
range right there.
Yes. And
But
so many
yeah.
people resonated with me being a parent who is raising a family here in Edmonton. And
Mm.
so there is an assumption, I guess, that I understand the issues, because raising a family is never easy. You
Mm.
you have to manage the finances, you're managing, the groceries, you're managing the kids, and juggling all of that is hard. And so somebody in that position is likely to be understanding to the many challenges that families face, because then, I would represent a typical family that is
Mm.
raising young children in this
Right.
current environment. And so
Right.
I heard a lot of that as well. So I would say people do want to know who the candidate is, and there are many ways of doing that. For example, somebody could just go to your website and read your story and
Yeah.
resonate with, what you have done and what you have done for other groups as well, and then they feel they can trust you and support you as well. And for some, it's reaching out to other people, because I know somebody called me and said, somebody had asked them if they knew me, because they were from the Zimbabwean community here in Edmonton, and they
Right.
asked them what kind of a person I was. And so this is somebody who wants to vote, probably doesn't have access to me yet, but is asking somebody who thinks knows me. But this person
Yeah.
unfortunately didn't know me, but
Mm.
they actually called me, and we had a conversation. So I spent a couple of hours on the phone just talking to people who wanted to know me as a candidate, and emails as well. People wrote and said, I'm considering voting for you, or I'm undecided right now. We had a lot of undecided voters in this election, but I need to know who you are. Can you give me a call? Can you tell me who you are? And we would have conversations that way. And I would answer their questions and share my story and who I was. And that's how I engaged with people. So relationships do matter with
Yeah.
to people, to voters. It matters who is representing them. They do care about that. So even if you have not had a chance to connect with everybody, just hearing other people talk about you and how they talk about you, and your story and what you have done, like your track record and how you have shown up for other people, can help people with deciding if a particular person is the type of leader that they would support and rally behind.
Yeah, I asked that question because obviously, in this particular election, the weirdest election I have ever seen, two party leaders lost their seats. I, I don't even know if Jonathan Pedno of the Greens, I've totally forgot about him. I don't know if he even won his seat. But clearly, Jagmeet Singh lost his seat, and Pierre Poilievre lost his riding to Bruce Fanjoy of the Liberal Party, and a lot of what I've heard people say about Pierre Poilievre in particular is the fact that Bruce Fanjoy was basically pounding the pavement every night and day, and basically was that ground game that gave him that victory in the end. So that's why I was curious about the sort of the influence of sort of the people voting for the MP as against people voting for the party. But the other thing that ties you that I think you can speak to, especially in this kind of situation where Pierre Poilievre has lost his riding, was the fact that in the case of Pierre Poilievre, his riding was newly redrawn, right? And you ran in a riding that was recreated. It's sort of been in and out of elections in the past, but it was newly brought back for this particular election, right? And I want to know what variables that throws up in when you're running a campaign, like you did in this election.
So I had the opportunity to speak to individuals that had been candidates in, and who and the areas that they had were areas that then became part of Edmonton Northwest. And so we have the data on how people vote in certain areas of a riding, and
Yeah.
so you can tell whether an area is highly conservative, highly liberal, highly NDP. And
Mm.
so yeah, when you redraw a riding, yeah, you can gain some I guess, who would vote for you. And for others, they could actually lose a certain area that would vote highly for them. But I believe this is an independent process that is independent of political parties, and that is carried out by an independent commission when it comes to redrawing the boundaries for ridings. But of course, yes, that comes into play, that certain parts of a riding could be lost to another riding that could have been beneficial to a candidate for sure.
Yeah.
So that happens. So, but that's generally speaking. It is not something that I would say would have happened in every scenario or in every circumstance that happened with the redrawing of the boundaries. You would need to look at the data then to really say for sure that based on the previous election, this is how people voted, and based on how the ridings were redrawn, this is how it affected a particular candidate in terms of gaining voters that are leaning more towards their party and them, or then losing some voters that were leaning for them. So you would
Yeah.
need to look at the data. It's not something that I would say would happen every single time. But of course, I would say that comes into play.
Okay. So I want to bring it back to representation. Because you were seeking people's votes in order to represent them, and I was curious. In Edmonton Northwest, this is a riding with a population close to 120,000. I want to say, what is important to those Edmontonians?
First and foremost, affordability is important to Edmontonians. Being able to afford groceries, rent, those issues came up. Groceries are really expensive. A rental is really expensive. Also tied to that is homelessness. That was an issue. Indigenous relations. I had many conversations, including seniors' homes, where the question was asked directly, what is the government going to do about reconciliation and relationships with
Mm.
the First Nations peoples? So that was a topical issue. For parents, daycare is really important. And as you know, we have the $10 a day program by the federal government. But
Yeah.
here in Alberta, we are not part of that because the Premier, Danielle Smith, removed the $10 a day daycare program in Alberta. And so
Right.
even me, as my son is in daycare, we are now paying more than we were paying when we were part of the federal program. So
Right.
a lot of parents are not happy about that. But of course, not many of them understood what had happened or why it was happening.
Okay.
And so we had conversations around that. And really, the issue is, believe it or not, it was challenging, especially for single parent households, to have
Right.
an extra $120 to your childcare bill that you didn't have. And especially in this current economy where you want to be making, getting the best out of, the income that you have.
Yeah.
And so for me, and being a woman and a woman who supports women empowerment, I thought we should be having programs that support women contributing economically rather than giving them a hard choice of staying at home and taking care of the children and relying on social services instead of going out to work and contributing to the economy. So for me personally, that's an issue that I'm still very passionate about and would want to see addressed. And as well, I would say Canada's sovereignty, especially with regards to the threat of tariffs from
Right.
the United States. That came up a lot in many conversations. And for people, they expressly said that they wanted a candidate who they believed could stand up to Donald Trump. So in their
Interesting.
minds, they were thinking, who is the best candidate to stand up to Donald Trump and protect Canada and our sovereignty? And not just about the tariffs, but also the threat of Canada becoming United States 51st state.
How did
And
you feel? How
people,
did you feel about that rhetoric? By the way, that.
I was against it from day one.
Mm.
I think in the beginning people thought it was a joke, and I remember saying right from the beginning,
Yeah.
that's a joke that went too far. If it was a joke, that is
Yeah.
like another man saying to another man, your family should become part of my family. If I am a man, I'm not taking that. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship we have. You're not
Yep.
joking like that, right?
Yep.
And so that was my stance from the beginning. I was like, joke or no joke, don't say that.
That's not funny. That's not fun.
That's not funny for anybody. And so
And
that was
why I
my stance
found
from
it
the beginning.
why I found it very even crazier was, yeah, I don't know if you watched McCartney's visit to the White House, and even after he said, "Oh, Canada will never be the 51st state," and it was like, you know how certain places are not for sale, and President Trump was like, "Never say never, never." I'm like, "No, no, never, never."
Never.
That's
All
what we
right.
said, never,
All right.
never. Anyways,
Yeah, it wasn't a funny
so
joke at all.
yeah, so you were talking about those. You mentioned a few things that are important to Edmontonians there, but you didn't mention oil for some reason. Is there a reason why oil didn't feature in your list over there?
I had some people comment on that, but it was mostly around Ottawa not supporting resource development in Alberta. So it was more on a provincial level that this came up, that the province is not getting its fair share on it, or a fair deal from Ottawa. So that came up. I would not put it. I did not hear that at the doors mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I showed up at the doors, affordability was first on the list.
Right.
Oil, yes. Like if we were on the street and somebody saw me and saw that I was wearing Liberal Party regalia and said, "You guys don't like us because you're not supporting the oil industry," and things
Yeah.
like that. That is when it came up. But in serious conversations on the doors, the issues that I mentioned were the issues that actually came up at the doors.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there is obviously the feeling that Canada has treated Alberta unfairly, and from your observation, I want to know, like, where have you seen that maybe Ottawa, or what do you think Ottawa could be doing better to support Albertans to sort of allay this feeling of being treated unfairly? Let's start there.
Right. So what I heard in conversations is that people have a different understanding of what this relationship looks like. The narrative is that Alberta is treated unfairly. But when you start going into the details, what I noticed is people don't have the details.
Oh, interesting.
People don't know how exactly. How does this happen? What is the relationship like? What should be happening that didn't happen? What were the numbers? People don't have those numbers. There are some that do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
so I can give you some examples here. So a lot of people will tell you about equalization payments, and I'd love for you to get into that. A lot of people will tell you about resource development in terms of like the oil cap, right? The cap on oil exploration and that kind of stuff. A lot of people might tell you about pipelines, which and Alberta getting access to tidewaters and to the east in order to get their products to different markets, right? And the difficulty selling oil within Canada as against like being able the relative ease with that they have selling that same oil to the United States, right? So those are potentially issues of contention for people. So how do you address that?
People that I talked to did not know about equalization payments. Some of them.
Oh, interesting.
Some that knew about the equalization payments did not know how they worked. There was an assumption that Alberta is asked, for example, to write a check to another province of a certain amount. That's how people thought the equalization payments work. So people would say, Alberta has money, and then the government just asks Alberta to support other provinces.
Interesting.
So there was that assumption, and also I would say there is a realization that we probably don't need, like Prime Minister Machona is saying, we don't need 13 different economies in Canada. We need one economy. And so that is the direction now that we are going. And I would say that would address some of the challenges in terms of access and making it easier for Albertan oil to be sold within Canada without needing to go through the United States, for example. And so I think there is a realization that there is a potential here to work together as Canadians to support Alberta with resources like oil, for example. And so what I would say to anybody who is listening here, lives in Alberta, or maybe not even in Alberta, is we need to read. We need to separate fact from fiction. Most of the time, as ordinary citizens, we don't really take the time to educate ourselves on how things work. For example, you would be shocked that most people don't even know the difference between the three levels of government that we have in Canada and who is responsible for what. And so that is something that I tried to do even after the election, to just use graphics and say, okay, this is what the municipal government is responsible for. So if you have an issue with these things, this is who is responsible for this. And these are provincial issues. These are federal issues. But of course, even if you have that understanding, you don't really know the dynamics of how all of these then work together.
Mm-hmm.
I had the privilege of learning some of that during campaign school over 8 weeks and getting
Yeah.
experts, professors from universities who work on policy, you know. So I was privileged to sit in front of those people and have an opportunity to ask questions about the relationships between the different levels of government and how they support each other. But not every citizen has that opportunity. So I feel there is a need to really educate each other in terms of understanding who is responsible for what. Because I think even politicians then take advantage of, of the ignorance that people have in terms of who is responsible for what. And then they just put out statements. And then people catch on to that because people really have valid frustrations and are angry and mad about some things. And then so when a statement is put out there that Ottawa treats Alberta unfairly, we have to pay other provinces. Literally, we think, okay, we have to pay other provinces. And so, yeah, we run with that message. But when you start having conversations with people and ask them, so how does Ottawa actually treat Alberta unfairly? Then somebody draws a blank.
Yeah, but also I've got to say though, while Alberta doesn't actually write a check to the federal government that then gets sent over to Quebec or whichever province gets the most of equalization payments, it is true that the government, something like 50%, I want to say, of the equalization payments, of the transfer payments coming out of the Fed goes to Quebec. And that feeling that, it's almost like you have a favorite child of 13 children. I know that's wild to say 13 children, but it's almost like you have a favorite child. And I want to tie this into Alberta separatists and that feeling. Obviously, you've heard Danielle Smith say recently that she wants a sovereign Alberta under a united Canada and not necessarily a full separation. Obviously, the separatists would like a full separation. In my opinion, they don't know what they're asking for because I know there's potential drawdowns there. And maybe you can speak to those drawdowns. But, clearly that feeling of frustration, that feeling of not being the favorite child is tied into physical like actions now where people are actually walking actively towards leaving Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we were just talking about the equalization payments and how people think they work without really going into how they work. And I do think that there is an opportunity to have a conversation about how they work because for Alberta they are calculated on a 5-year average, and so maybe a recalculation of those or a different method of calculating those in to support Alberta more could be a way to sort of level the field, so to speak, and have Alberta being supported in the way that the province feels they should be supported. But of course, there are other transfers that happen outside of the equalization payments to support projects here in Alberta. And so we when we have this conversation or this debate, we need to have the facts. This is what I would say to people: have the facts, gather the facts. The government of Canada has as data available on what transfers happened, how much was collected in federal taxes, who received what over the years. And so it's incumbent upon us and upon each other really through platforms like this to say, here's information, here's how funds were disbursed, here's how transferred happened between the different provinces. This is what the federal government transferred to Alberta to support certain projects. Because I tell you, some people don't even know.
Right.
Absolutely have no clue. They just believe that the money from Alberta just goes to different provinces, and the federal government has never supported any of our programs. I could tell you that when you go into the weeds, even with healthcare that
Yeah.
we have here in Alberta, there is a portion of the federal government involved in that, such that to the question of separating, we could potentially lose that if separation were to happen. So I
Right.
would caution people and say, before you pick a position, take the time. Take the time to really separate fact from fiction, get an understanding of how things work, what has happened, what is the position. And when you're really, I guess, calm and objective, and you look at facts and the data, you will get a totally different picture of things and where things are at. And you may realize, yes, there are challenges, but probably they're not as big as we have been made to believe that they are. And
Right.
so, yes, we still need to solve these challenges, but it's not it's not a train smash. It's something that we could say, now that we have this opportunity where we're all coming together as Canadians and saying we need to have one economy instead of 13 different economies. Then, how do we bring the issues that Alberta has with the federal government to the table, and what do we really need? So some people don't have an idea of what it even means to separate. Because what this means for some people, it just means that if we separate, all the money now that we were sending to the federal government is now ours, and we get to choose what to do with it. But do people also know how the federal government also supports Alberta?
Right.
How Canada, how does Alberta benefit by being part of Canada? People aren't going into those discussions. They aren't really. It's an emotional debate right now rather than a factual debate, is what I would say. But I think maybe as the emotions start to die down a little bit, and people continue having these conversations, that okay, what is real, what is not real, how do things actually work, what has been happening, who has done what in the past, and what policies did they create, and do we still need these policies, or do we need to come up with different policies? I think people will start seeing things much clearer, and then we may realize that the answer is not in separating, because rather it's in creating a very different relationship where we feel that Alberta is getting a fair deal.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to press a little bit there, in terms of something like a third. Yeah, and I hear you when you're saying maybe Albertans have it a lot better than they think they do if they only looked beneath the surface, if they looked under the hood and looked beyond the rhetoric, right? But at the same time, something like a third, I think was the anonymous poll there. Something like a third of Albertans are in favor of separating right now. That movement seems to be gaining some traction, especially a lot of people believe a pipeline across Canada, for example, and an energy corridor or freedom to explore resources in a certain way is how they reset that relationship with Ottawa. So I guess what I want to get is, how do you think that Alberta separatist movement goes in over the next 4 years?
I There's a lot happening, believe me, in terms of this whole issue with separation. They are organizations that are being set up against separation. There are organizations that have already been set up for separation and that have already started, engaging with people.
Yeah.
And so, and people have different views about what should happen. Some people think that the referendum should go ahead. That is for separation. And as you know, we have a local politician, former deputy premier here, Thomas Lukaszek, who has filed with the Alberta elections to have a referendum on Alberta remaining a province of Canada.
Yeah.
And so now we will probably have two different referenda that are asking two opposite questions. I'm not clear legally what that is going to look like, but
Right.
there are those that believe that having a referendum is the way to do it. Some people actually believe, who are actually gaining momentum and traction as well, that let's not even get to the point where we have a referendum at all. None whatsoever. Let's
Right.
just not have this conversation, because it's separating is not the way to go. So let's not even waste time and resources with holding a referendum. So we have different views on what should be done. So in terms of what's going to happen within the next 4 years, I'll say it depends on who else shows up on the scene. and how strong their message is and how it resonates with people. Because I think ultimately that is what it will boil down to, whether people actually, I guess, buy into the idea that separating is the way to go, or whether people just stick to their guns and say, we don't want to separate. Yes, we acknowledge there are issues that we still need to solve and talk about so that, Alberta is getting a fair deal from the federal government, but separating is not the way. So we have very different views. And so, but what I would like to see is more education, really, for people
So yeah. So how
before
does
people
yeah? Sorry, go on, go on.
before people actually get to know and understand what they're voting for. It brings into question a question that we always have in politics. If a voter is uninformed and they go and vote, is that fair?
Mm.
Right? That happens. If somebody is uninformed and then they're expected to be part of a decision making process, then is that process credible? That's a fair question to ask. And so
Yeah.
what I would like to see more personally is more education and understanding about the issues. We
Right.
want as citizens to get to a point where when we go and cast a vote for a yes or no, we know exactly what we're saying yes to. We may get into a situation where people say yes to something, the following morning they realize they've lost their passport, universal healthcare, CPP, and people say, this is not what I voted for. We've heard that before.
Right.
So personally, I would advocate for more education for voters, for citizens, for Albertans to know exactly what they're voting for or against.
So that's point. I think I want you to touch on that particular topic is this, right? There's a certain group of people that, irrespective of however much you press on the point, oh, Albertans are gaining this much from the federal government right now. The Liberal government bought the TMX pipeline, and they gave you that pipeline that is now pumping our product and getting your product to market, and all of these things that Alberta enjoys under the federation. The fact is, the rhetoric and obviously I'm not an Albertan. I can't say, I don't want to speak definitively about knowing what is going on the ground. There is that feeling, whether people are in favor of secession or not, that Ottawa has long treated Alberta unfairly. Saskatchewan also has similar opinions on this. How does Ottawa reset that relationship in your mind? Because I don't think going and telling them, oh, it's almost like having a quarrel with your partner, and then you tell them something like, oh, actually you're wrong to think the way you think. Well, that's just not going to work, right? That's not, and then you try and kind of like talk your way through it by telling them that they're wrong to think the way they think.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So how does Ottawa reset that relationship?
I would say on that one, there's no need to guess anymore because Prime Minister Mark Carney has been meeting with all the premiers and
Right.
has asked for their plans. That's a great start. That's a great start to any discussion and any dialogue. And so for me, I would say we've put wheels on on that vehicle, and so let's wait to see what comes out of that process. I think that what Prime Minister Mark Carney has done is great, to say we realize that we have missed opportunities here, but we
Mm-hmm.
want to come together as Canadians. And so the premiers have been engaged already, and they are going to submit their plans. And I believe that is an opportunity for Alberta to then present the plans that the current Alberta government would like to see in terms of resetting that relationship with Ottawa. So I think that engagement was the very first step. And even if I were in that position, that is exactly what I would do. It starts with listening, and
Right.
then inviting people to share their ideas, present what they would want, and then start the negotiations. It's going to be a negotiation, and we have to understand that it's going to be a negotiation. One thing,
Yeah.
Victor, that I'll tell you throughout this whole campaign that I learned first and foremost was, right now I have a huge appreciation of politicians that I never had before I ran.
Right.
I will tell you, we must totally appreciate the people that put their hands up to represent us politically.
Right.
The amount of responsibility and expectation, and some that are unrealistic, that lies on their shoulders is enormous.
Mm.
Just me as a candidate and the number of issues that I received in my inbox, I cannot begin to tell you how much that would maybe triple or quadruple for somebody who is now an elected official for a riding, for example, a member of parliament.
Yeah.
There are many different sectors that have challenges that and so various interests, various needs that you would need to juggle, and maybe sometimes with very little resources, very little time, and try. It's like you have to try and please everybody, and sometimes it's just not possible to do that. But
Right.
we have to come to a point where we can do our best. So personally, how I approach life, and my own personal values is I understand that concessions have to be made with everything. It's unrealistic to expect that you would always get what you want anyhow.
Right.
Because
Right.
even if you have a certain level of thinking, for example, I had a conversation with somebody who was for separating, and then we started talking about the land. And now all of a sudden, we bring in the indigenous perspective that wasn't there when the discussion started. And now all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, okay, there is this that I had not considered. Now, how does this change my thinking around this, or my strategy around that? So you're going to learn a lot of things as we do this, as we undergo this process and this transformation and change and exploration of whatever it is, whether it's how do we support Alberta oil or the oil and gas sector, or, should we be separating from Canada or not? New information will come up that, and rightly so, you would not have known because you were not having the conversation. But I always say, go into a negotiation with an open mind and with an open heart, and understand that there are interests that you will become aware of, that you would need to consider, that you were not aware of. And you need to be in a position where you are balanced. And for me, I speak like this because balance is one of my values.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's I am never for one person winning and the other person losing. I would lose sleep over a situation like that. I would like as much as possible to have a situation where we have a win-win, if possible, as much as possible. And so that's how I would approach this. But really want to reiterate that let's educate ourselves. Let's read. Let's find credible sources to become more informed, so that if it gets to voting for anything, you know exactly what you're voting for. You're not just voting for a slogan or a mantra, but you know the plan that backs up that slogan or that mantra. You're not caught unawares and then crying after that, oh, we were misled.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So I did, as we kind of were getting close to the end here. So I wanted to ask you, you spoke about Prime Minister Carney there collecting these projects, nation building projects from the premiers, and soon they will get announcements on which projects are going to move forward. So part of something that's moving through the legislature in BC here, and I'll see if you, I want to know if you're familiar with Bill C-15 here in BC, a little bit. But just the lowdown of this bill is essentially, it's a bill that's meant to fast track provincially significant projects, essentially. And the part of the pushback it's gotten, especially from Indigenous people, well, first is that there's not enough, there wasn't enough consultation in the drafting of that bill, and there's a possibility that the government would push through projects that would be harmful to the environment. So Indigenous people and environmental activists agree on that. And obviously on the conservative side, there's the feeling that the government might be overreaching a little bit where they can sort of slap a label of provincially significant on a project, and whether that project receives consensus from all parties, they can essentially push that through. I wonder where you sit on that, because we're in a time right now where the current liberal government, is looking to push through these nation building projects, and there is no way we get to a point where this country is productive and the economy is growing and moving the way we want if projects take 10 years to get to get through the pipeline, right? So how do you speak to that?
I would answer as a person who is for the communities and really believe that community engagement is imperative. It's not a choice. And so I would say that you would not want to jump over people's heads or step on their toes just to get to a certain outcome, because if you run, you break things. And you get caught up in all types of lawsuits that could possibly delay
Right.
the project even further. And so I would say, let's do the right things. And by this, I mean, respect the treaties, engage with the indigenous peoples, and let's come to an understanding of, what needs to be done and how is this going to be beneficial to the First Nations themselves and to Canada in general. And so I would say there is a downside to rushing things and to not following due process when engaging in things like building pipelines, for example. It's
Right.
absolutely important to respect treaty rights and the views of the indigenous peoples and to engage them. So I would say the engagement definitely needs to happen. The conversations need to happen, and then negotiations had with First Nations.
Yeah.
That is how
Yeah.
I would approach that.
Yeah, of course, and the BCNDP, if I was trying to be fair to them here, the BCNDP led by Premier David Eby have said that they will still the projects they will choose are going to be projects that we all agree as provincially significant. They say they would be obvious. I don't know what that really means. In terms of environmental considerations, they say that they will still do the the requisite level of environmental and indigenous consultation
Yep.
before they push through projects. But essentially, the idea is to cut down that timeline to sort of a more manageable timeline, essentially, right? So that they can deliver projects on time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I can
yeah,
totally understand that, as long as that doesn't mean that. Well, what does cutting mean
right.
to him, and what does that look like? And so again, we go back to the question of the how these things happen. They say the devil is in the details,
Mm,
and so if you don't have the details, sometimes it's hard to speak to a certain issue without knowing the plan. So knowing the plan is really important. What do those timelines look like? Are they even realistic?
right.
Would be the other question there. So I would say whatever happens has to have the input of the communities that would be impacted by those projects, and they need to have a say in that, and
Mm-hmm.
need to agree and need to negotiate. And if there is need for mediation, if it comes to that, then there is that. So I guess as things unfold, we they will know what's needed to get things moving. But
Right.
my own personal assessment, and from my experience of having worked with indigenous communities, is that relationships first
Right.
relationships first. And I know that doesn't really fit well with the model of getting business done,
Yeah.
but maybe that is the mindset shift that we need to have, so that we're creating a Canada where everybody feels like they have a voice and they're being heard, and that that's part of reconciliation. It means honoring and respecting the indigenous people's views and the relationship to the land. And
Yeah.
there is a space for that in politics, and we may not have seen that in the past, but I think that is part of reconciliation here in Canada, and we need to honor and respect that.
But what do you do when, I mean, there's clearly certain interests that may never be harmonized. So Alberta wants oil and they want pipelines that will go all the way from the west through Quebec, all of those places. Quebec is obviously very, very sensitive about pipelines going through their land. So there's interests like that may never be harmonized. But at the same time, as a country, we have to match on. To grow this economy, we have to get productive. What do you do? I guess is what I'm trying to understand here.
I would never be for muzzle your way into things 100%. My view has always been everything should be a give and take.
Okay.
Everything should be a give and take. Should be willing to give something, and really, nobody is ever in a position where they should just be taking, and nobody should ever be in a position where they should just be giving.
Right.
And so this is one of the challenges that I have, Victor. I'll tell you this. When it comes to politics, people would rather be on one of the extremes. That is how we've always done things.
Right.
My thinking has been let's come to the center. Let's come together and work through things and start thinking about others other than ourselves.
Right.
Because when we start thinking about ourselves more than we think about others, and we start labeling other people, that is where we get into harming other people. But we need some balance. That has been missing in my view. We are highly polarized, and we think that sometimes we should just do things because we have not gotten consensus. But just because somebody said no to something yesterday does not mean that they will have the same view today. People change their minds, and that depends on what the topic is, what is on the table for them, and we need different approaches. We need to continue to have the conversation is how I would approach this.
So actually, the reason why, or maybe I should rephrase the way I've asked that question. So I'll give you an example of the energy corridor, right? That's something where to people in Alberta, for example, that looks like includes a pipeline, right? To a person in Quebec, that looks like more alternative energy, more sustainable energy sources, right? So I guess in the end, it's like, okay, I understand that from the perspective of the government, there has to be an economic model that needs to be put in place. Maybe I'm answering my own question here. From the perspective of the government, there needs to be an economic model for, okay, is there a business case for a pipeline going across Canada and all the things that come with that? And does the benefit outweigh the cost of doing that, right? If for all the possible environmental degradation that will happen, is there a benefit to that for the nation as a whole, right? Mm-hmm. That's where I was trying to go with that question. But I'm going to leave that because I do appreciate that I've taken a lot of your time this evening, and I want to bring this to a close. So I think my final question for you, I want to say is, obviously there's time now between this election, which is over right now, and there's a possibility that, because obviously the Liberals are in a minority government, and I know the Conservatives wouldn't mind getting to an election as soon as they can. There is that vision for them, I bet, but there's a chance you could have an election anywhere from a year from now to 4 years from now. So I assume that you're going to run again. So what are you doing now to get ready for that next election? And I'm not asking you, obviously I shouldn't ask you to give away what your strategy is in case anybody's listening over there, but what do you do between now and the next election?
I would say continue to engage with people, continue to be visible, continue to advocate for businesses however I can, for different cultural groups that I came in contact with during the election, and also continue to be part of the broader national conversation in terms of how we should be moving forward as Canadians. And I think everything rests on engagement, connecting with people, having conversations, listening to people, building relationships that are meaningful, that are based on a genuine heart to really get to know people and to serve people. There is huge distrust. And I'll tell you this, one of the most humbling experiences for me on the campaign was how much people have been disappointed by politics over the years, but still show up and vote. Every election, people still have faith and belief in the system, that the system will deliver. So for me, as an individual, I believe that when I step into that role, I carry a huge responsibility to the people that I'm going to represent, if elected, for example. And that responsibility is to represent them, and maybe not even the party that I represent, but them as the people who have given me the responsibility to represent them. And voting for me is one of the primary ways that people exercise their voice and their democracy. And to me, that is important. And so it's respecting and honoring people for who they are and what they have chosen to share and give you. And this is from, African values that tie into Indigenous values as well. And I see a way that those values we can weave those and bring those into Canadian politics. And I'm a huge believer that those values have space in politics. And it's all about people. We can't even talk about leaders without people. We can't talk about building policies without people at the center of them. And so we need to invest in those who matter, and it's the people. And so for me, that is who I would put first and foremost. So it's all about relationship building.
Right.
For me.
And I'm going to make this my final question for you. This is probably, there's different ways to be Canadian, right? And I want to know what Canadian identity is to you.
Canadian identity for me is caring for each other, regardless of who we are. So when I care about somebody, how do I show up for them? How do I want to make them feel? And that is making them feel seen, making them feel heard, and making them feel safe. And that is the vision of Canada that I have. And I would say, by and large, that is who we are as Canadians. Yes, we have challenges, we have disagreements, we see things differently. But honestly, when we are faced with like an existential threat to who we are able to come together as Canadians. We're able to.
Yeah, that was a wild thing I saw with the Trump thing. Yeah.
Yes. So that is who we are. We care about each other.
Yes.
So that is what being Canadian means to me.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Lindsey. I really appreciate that you've been generous with your time so far. People at home, Lindsey Machona, everybody.
Thank you so much, Victor. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on the show.
All right.
See you guys. If you're new to the channel, you know what to do. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.